first of all, I'm sitting for the most part because I have sciatica, so I'll try to stand. But and I wanted to thank the Coxford family very much for their endowing this lecture. Without endowments like this, all of our universities would be poorer, specifically with reaching out to the public, mixing academic and public engagement. So I'm going to do that today. I'm going to mix academic and public engagement. I'm going to start out with some of my technical work, some of my philosophy of language work in the book that Andrew just mentioned. Andrew and I went to grad school together, by the way. So, I'm going to bring it to bear on a topic that's as old as political philosophy itself, namely the topic of democracy and propaganda. As many of you know, in Book 8 of Plato's Republic, he argues that democracy leads directly to tyranny. And this is an argument via demagoguery. So Plato says that democracy has as its foundational value liberty, and that means anyone can run for office. And so the people who are least suited to run for office will run for office. That's happened before. And since they have liberty, they have freedom of speech, and they will lie. They will say there's an internal enemy and an external enemy. They will constantly have wars. And then they'll represent themselves as the protector of the people, and then they will end democracy and rule as tyrants. And this is the beginning of a multi-millennial long discussion of the tenability of democracy as a system. So Rousseau argues that, well, people are not going to be susceptible to demagoguery if there's no large inequalities. So Rousseau's idea is that if you have a society where people have health care, and there's no super rich people, and people generally are not resentful of each other, then people will not be resentful of each other, and then it'll be hard to set people against each other. So that's Rousseau's solution to this problem. But it was taken to be a really devastating problem for democracy. And one way of dealing with it is legislating against disinformation, legislating against lies, legislating against hate speech. So that's one way societies deal with it. I'm going to argue today that it's much more problematic to do this because the problem of propaganda does not just concern lies and disinformation. So it concerns things that go to the very heart, but you can still, the very heart of meaning, human meaning, what it is to be human, namely our identities. That said, you do have countries like Germany which ban parties that have the incorrect social identity for a democracy. So you can't in Germany have a party that's based on Blut und Boden, blood and soil. So the issue about banning Alternative für Deutschland, their fascist party, is do they have this conception of citizenship? And that's a social identity. It's not disinformation, it's not lies, it's not hate speech. It's a conception of what it is to be German. That is illegal in Germany. It violates the Verfassung, the Constitution. So there are ways to deal with the problem that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to start with this framework. I just realized the big problem is if I'm facing you like that. So there's technical problems with this setup. So this, I believe, should be the table of contents of my 2023 book, The Politics of Language with David Beaver. I'm going to use the material from this book in discussion in this talk. So in particular, part one is how words connect people, presupposition and ideology, and part three is idealization, and part four is expression and freedom. Now, disinformation is presented as the main epistemic threat to democracy. And because I had written How Propaganda Works in like 2016, 2017, when they still had humanists at these conferences, I was at all these like State Department conferences on funded the Hoover Institute on propaganda, and then they got rid of all the humanists. and I remember there was this like tech guy like high up in Apple. Like, there's no problem. We can deal with this problem in 6 months. We'll just label all the false statements. No issue at all. So, you know, if you know Silicon Valley people, they are extremely self-confident. So the idea that disinformation is the main problem, you know, then maybe you could legislate against it, maybe you could label it. But it isn't. First of all, the misinformation paradigm is obviously problematic as an account of the force of propagandistic images in film. And, you know, this is kind of, this hurts you with like commercial law. I don't know if commercial law is the right expression to use, but you can't lie in advertising, right? But have you noticed you can lie with images? So, you know, you can have an image that suggests that if you buy a Kia or a Honda, that that will radically increase your sexual attractiveness. So that is a standard, and which is a lie, actually. I used to have a Honda Civic. So I had to switch to a Mercedes. So misinformation, the misinformation paradigm harms us in advertising because it's just, you know, much of advertising is imagistic. So how do you deal with those bans? Now we could try to treat images in film. We could try to fit it into the disinformation paradigm. But obviously that's going to be a program that some analytic philosopher is going to love. Like, you know, oh, let's just make it a sense of possible worlds. But, you know, that would be a really funny comment if you were all analytic philosophers. But that is obviously just like a project to try to show off. It's not going to work. Although one of my students, Gabe Greenberg at UCLA, that was his dissertation. But it was very, very limited. It was like really limited. So, but what about speech? You might think, okay, with speech we could do it. That's why you can like restrict advertising with sentences. You can't lie, but images, you know, whatever. But this presupposes that the function of speech is to communicate information, and when this goes wrong, isn't it misinformation? And behind this is the content delivery model. That the general idea that communication consists of conveying meaning inside container-like vessels containing of symbols. The speaker's job is to wrap the meaning up, and the hearer's job is to unwrap it. So, now this is a conception of meaning that has long been challenged, and even though it really affects a lot of disciplines, it has long been challenged. So here's Malinowski. Are words emphatic communion used primarily to convey meaning? The meaning, the meaning which is symbolically theirs? Certainly not. They fulfill a social function, and that is their principal aim. But they are neither the result of intellectual reflection. We may say that language does not function here as a means of transmission of thought. Each utterance is an act serving the direct aim of building hearer to speaker by a tie of some social sentiment or another. So, a tie of some social binding hearer to speaker. So communication is not about wrapping and unwrapping packages. It's rather about a tie of some social sentiment or other. So let's look at, now I want to turn to how this idea might play out with political debate. So let's look at the words of equality and freedom. So I mean, I promised someone I would quote Carl Schmitt here. Schmitt says at some point, humanity has no enemy, at least on this planet. This is not contradicted by the fact that every war in history has been waged in the name of humanity. So it's the word humanity that then gets charged with emotion and resonance. So, so if you look at for example, the same is true of free and independent, right? So all under our system stand upon the same broad principles of perfect equality. And further, the government's cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the black person is not equal to the white man. Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy. So under our system, perfect equality. And yet in the same sentence, inequality. The system is based on inequality. So what's going on? Second, the state of Georgia is in full possession and exercise of all those rights of sovereignty which belong and appertain to a free and independent state. Well, Georgia succeeded to preserve slavery. The same language also occurs in the secession acts of Virginia, Georgia, Arkansas, North Carolina, Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky. So why does everyone fight in the name of freedom, even if you're fighting for slavery? Well, that's because, as Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. points out, freedom rings. So Toni Morrison, this is Toni Morrison, who argues that freedom and individualism for many white Americans are so powerful because they resonate with the unfreedom of black Americans. So now if you're having trouble understanding that, think about the image, at least for me, an image that was sort of very powerfully represented freedom in the textbooks with which I was raised. Settlers heading west in covered wagons. That very much was like, wow, freedom. They're not constrained by laws anymore. They're going into a free jungle or whatever's in the West, and they're going to be creating their own society. But that notion of freedom is predicated on indigenous genocide. That only is a conception of freedom if you're thinking about seizing indigenous lands. And indeed, one of the tyrannies of the King of England that led to the American Revolution was that he didn't let Americans go west and seize indigenous land. So freedom was the freedom to commit genocide. So Toni Morrison's point is that freedom and equality have resonated for many Americans with white identity. And so that's why it's not a surprise that we find freedom in these documents of succession, whose purpose is to defend slavery. Now, Melvin Rogers, in his book, The Dark and Blighted Faith, singles out the aspirational democratic rhetoric as a central theme in African-American political thought. Now, Frederick Douglass warred with William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionist, because Douglass said, the debate was about whether the Constitution should be retained, viewed as a slave document or a document of freedom. Now, of course, the Constitution was written, in a way to allow slavery. But Douglass demanded that the Constitution be used, instead of being derided. Douglass said, no, we should take these ideals seriously, and we should use them to accuse white Americans of hypocrisy. Now, this is why it's so dangerous. This is why Surkov, Putin's propaganda minister, attacked democracy. Because the idea is, if you make democratic ideals if people think, okay, it's all just ridiculous democratic ideals, freedom and equality, it's all BS, then you can't say that anti-democratic politicians are being hypocritical. But it's really key to use that move. And the Black Freedom Movement has always used that move. It said, we're supposed to be a democracy, freedom and equality are supposed to be central to who we are, so we can accuse you of hypocrisy. So if you want to attack democracy, one way to do it is say democracy is ridiculous, freedom and equality are ridiculous, we're all really tyrannies hidden beneath this. And this is what Schmitt thought, that democracy was that's his quote about humanity. All political concepts are merely weapons. That's what Schmitt argued. They're all hypocritical. That's the nature of politics. He was a Nazi, by the way. So we can see the terrain of U.S. politics, indeed all politics, partly in terms of the struggle of the meanings of the word freedom, that is, over its resonances. So in our view, in our book, each word belongs to a speech practice. An utterance of that word is an instantiation of the speech practice. In virtue of being an instantiation of a speech practice, the word has the resonances it does. So words carry their histories with them. And when you're doing, for example, slur reclamation, you're trying to reclaim a slur, what you're trying to do is you're trying to change the speech practices from negative to positive. So queer was a terrible slur, and then now there are queer studies departments because you changed the resonances of the word. You engaged. Judith Butler argued that this was, instead of hate speech restrictions, you should change the speech practice behind the word. So Judith Butler is a civil libertarian. They're arguing that the way to deal with these problems is by power struggles over the meanings of words. So a speech practice determines the informational content of a word, but excessive focus on this feature of speech practices gives rise to the content delivery model. But any word has resonances aside from its reference or extension. I'm Jewish, so I'm going to use the word mom. All sorts of emotion, all sorts of gendered relations, right? So now I think it's here I'm going to make a move in non-ideal philosophy of language that's familiar from Charles Mills and debates about non-ideal political philosophy. If you pretend that all there is to speech is information, then you're acting, or if you say that, or that's all you investigate, you're ignoring all these other features. You're acting like they don't matter. And so then, you could be like, well, what do you mean? I spoke the truth when I said there's a problem of laziness in the inner city. Okay, so attunement this is another notion from our theory. An agent is attuned to something to the extent that their state and behavior predictably evolves in accordance with its presence in the agent's context. So you're attuned to something essentially if both of us are attuned to the same thing if we're paying attention to it. If I say, this is my bottle of water, we're all now attuned to this object. But we can be attuned to emotions too, to values, to social identities, to practices. So an agent is attuned to a practice to the extent that their state and behavior predictably evolve in accordance with its presence in the agent's context. So I might be attuned to the practice of killing insects, like the process of killing insects, or milking cows, or attuned to the process of question sessions in a philosophy question period, where you never say anything good. That's not part of the practice. You only ever raise criticism. Public lecture is very different. A dispositional attunement to I'm going to cut out some of the theoretical stuff to get to the important public stuff, the applications. So there's also cognitive attunement, affective attunement, and crucially for this talk, attunement to social identity. A community of practice is a set of individuals with strong collective attunements to a set of practices, such that no larger set of individuals has similarly strong or stronger collective attunements to a set of practices. Let me just say something about all this. This is a 500-page book. And the reason I did it is because in my book, How Propaganda Works, I was using the standard models of analytic philosophy to bring to bear on propaganda. And then I realized they didn't work at all. They were completely unsuited. So, you know, I couldn't go on TV and talk about the theoretical apparatus and formal semantics. It was absolutely pointless. It didn't make any help you at all with rhetoric and political speech. So what I did with David Beaver is I went backwards. I started from what I wanted to say about politics and rhetoric, and then I went backwards to build the theory. That's really what we did. So an ideology is a system of collective attunements among members of a community of practice. So like, if we have the same ideology, we respond negatively to the same things, or positively to the same things. So that's you know, you could have an ideology that makes you hate plastic water bottles, like an environmental ideology. So you're shocked when you see this bottle. More particularly, this happened in Canada, which, you know, I came here because it was a racial paradise, and I found out quickly, because I thought that quickly. And this person, an actual professor, was like, yeah, I was brought up by a racist family, and so when I see a mixed race, an interracial couple, I still can't help but feel a feeling of shock and disapproval and disgust. So that's like, she was raised with a racist ideology, and it has these effects on her to this day. So a discriminatory ideology is an ideology that includes attunements to in-group, out-group distinctions in which members of the out-group are valued less than members of the in-groups, and hence is inherently deserving of less than equal treatment. So expressions resonate with ideologies. You might think mom, for many people, resonates with a gendered ideology. So we can speak then of attunement to ideologies, a crucial notion in our work. Okay, I'm going to skip. You don't really care about the Stalnaker-Lewis conception of some common ground. So now this is the third big notion. Much behavior is driven by a need to minimize dissonance. An addict might say, you know, my kid tells me, no, screens are not bad. I'm not addicted to screens. What are you talking about? There's just really enjoyable Instagram reels that keep me up till 5 in the morning. He missed school the other day, slept until 3. So it's not addiction. So similarly, members of a cult might be unwilling to accept the failings of a leader. So minimizing dissonance. Harmony is an experience of consonance or dissonance resulting from relations between attunements, and we seek collective harmony. And mass events are about creating collective harmony. So with this theoretical background, you can show that disinformation is not the problem. To focus on truth is to idealize political movements as centered around sets of propositions with which people agree or disagree based on available information. But groups harmonize around resonance. Like, we feel, you know, think of 2 minutes of hate in Orwell. It's like it's a mass event where you're harmonizing around around the emotion of hatred towards whoever is your enemy that day. So the ideological resonances of practice. Okay, I'm gonna. So here, Q drops. You can tell how old when our book started. So it turned out Q was right. There was a pedophilic conspiracy. So I feel kind of bad about dismissing it back then. So the question is not whether the Q drop is true, right? It turned out to be true, except nobody was actually Q. Q was actually not Q. The idea was Trump was Q. He was trying to tell us about this conspiracy. But the question, but the Q drop was just meant to resonate. I guess I have to replace this example. So the problem propaganda poses to democracy is not centrally about disinformation. It's about social identities and ideologies. It's about, you know, these systems that lead us to create in-groups and out-groups, think certain people are less valuable than other people, and are so are not equal. And democracy is about freedom and equality, those two values. So let's now turn to friend and enemy. Now I'm going to argue that there are friend-enemy distinctions that are, you know, not only okay but required. Any war or conflict involves a friend-enemy distinction, for example. Let's say an antagonistic ideological social group or an antagonistic community of practice is a community of practice for which a central feature of the ideology is a strongly negative collective emotional attunement to some other social group. So sports fandom would be an example, right? But polarization involves the growth of an ideologically rich grouping that is collectively strongly antagonistic toward a significant group of others in the same society. Now, I don't think political polarization is not a bad thing in and of itself. If there are Nazis, it would be ridiculous to be like, the Civil War was a problem of polarization. You know, one group thought there should be slavery, and the other group thought there shouldn't, and they were polarized. Isn't that tragic? That would be entirely the wrong description of the Civil War. That was not the problem. The problem was the existence of a group that believed that slavery was the correct. So now let's turn to genocidal speech. Use this framework to look at genocidal speech. So I'm going to talk about friend-enemy distinctions that are deeply problematic and friend-enemy distinctions that are required in conditions of conflict but are not genocidal. So a genocidally antagonistic ideological social group is a community of practice whose identity is based on being existentially imperiled by the existence of another group. So of course, in Thucydides, Cleon's speech about them in the Mytilenean debate, he says the Mytileneans will kill us all unless we kill all of them. So he's urging genocide of the Mytileneans, right? So by saying that they're an existential risk. National Socialism defined Aryans as a genocidally antagonistic ideological social group whose enemy were Jews. The idea is if any Jews survived, then it would be an existential threat for Germans. So Himmler's Poznan speech is of course, you know, really thought-provoking. Is not the expression I'm reaching for here. But he's saying that only the most moral people can be SS, because the SS have to slaughter lots of kids, they have to put them in, burn the barns down, and you have to be really moral to do that, because you have to overcome your moral revulsion to realize you're doing it for the good of Germany. You know, you're doing this genocide for the good of Germany, and only like a really moral person can do that. So Joseph Goebbels describes this threat of Judeo-Bolshevism as follows, 1935 speech. In its final consequences, it signifies the destruction of all the commercial, social, political, and cultural achievements of Western Europe in favor of a deracinated and nomadic international cabal, which has found its representation in Judaism. So the idea is, you know, in Nazi ideology, is that Judaism is an existential threat to civilization. Now I want to look at some instances of genocidal speech. So Russian propaganda against Ukraine. So it really resembles this Nazi narrative. So Ukraine is the enemy of Russia and is a tool of the West used to destroy Russia. So the West has supposedly abandoned its traditional European values in favor of an ideology described as Western totalitarianism, the imposed programs of civilizational degradation and disintegration, the mechanisms of subjugation under the superpower of the West of the United States. Russia is the last authority protecting and preserving these values of historical Europe. Now, colonialism always requires a civilization savagism paradigm, right? The colonial power is civilization, and the colonized group is they're savages. This is a little tricky in Hannah Arendt's part 2 of Origins of Totalitarianism, because Arendt is anti-imperialist but buys into the civilization savagism paradigm. So her objection to European colonization of Africa is that it drags Europeans down to the level of Africans, which is actually not the objection to European colonization of Africa. But, okay, so you see this very explicit genocidal speech. Ukrainian identity that is an anti-Russian construct that has no civilizational substance of its own. And then here are just instances, there's no pity for any of them. Shoot them all. And and here, crucial to Russian nationalist ideology here is that the Ukrainian people do not exist, right? It's only an invented category to wage war against Russia, destroy Russia. The Ukrainian people do not. That's genocidal talk. So, for the return of all primordial Russian land. So, Ukrainian people do not exist. We will wipe them out. We'll shut down Ukraine as a problem once and all. We can exterminate. So, lots of examples of genocidal speech. The next example is the genocide in Gaza. We find exactly the same terminology. Of course, the basis for the UN finding that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza. So here are some quotes. You probably know these. You must remember what Amalek has done to you, who tried to destroy the Jewish people in the Bible. Our hero troops, they've won supreme goal to completely defeat the murderous enemy and to guarantee our existence in this country. We've always said never again is now. I don't know. Similarly, in a letter to the Israeli soldiers and commanders in the war on 3rd November 2023, Netanyahu stated, remember what Amalek did to you. This is a war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. So it's the same as Cleon about the Mytileneans. If the Mytileneans exist, they will do a genocide of you. So then Israel is fighting human animals, and then this is exactly the same as Russia. Is there Palestinian history or culture? There's none. There's no such thing as a Palestinian people. Now, what you have here, my reading of what's going on is a war about Jewish identity. So many people will say, I'm extremely Jewish. I was like the 3rd-ranked Jewish person at Yale. This is a war about Jewish identity. Israel's leaders are trying to say that Jewish identity is existentially committed to killing Palestinians, or all Palestinians. Jewish identity is inconsistent with the existence of a Palestinian people. They must be a fiction, or they must not exist. Same as what Putin is trying to do with Russia. Of course, Israel didn't exist before 1948, so there was plenty of Jewishness before the state of Israel, and the 20th century had, the Jewish Bund was an enormous movement in Eastern Europe that was anti-Zionist. There's a great book by Molly Crabapple coming out about the Jewish Bund called "Here Where We Live, This Is Our Land." In other words, Europe is our land. And so Jewish identity is, I believe as a Jewish person whose kids are in Jewish day school, etc., that we've never had a Christmas tree in my house. That's the key to Jewish identity. There's a war about Jewish identity, where people are trying to say that Jewish identity is equivalent to, is somehow essentially involved the political state of Israel, rather than Israel being a theological thing. something in the Bible that we're connected to theologically. They're trying to say that Jewish identity is essentially tied to the state of Israel. And my colleague Mohammed Fadel at the University of Toronto, I forget where, he looked at like all the instances of reported anti-Semitic instances in like, in some region, I forgot where, I think somewhere in Canada, or, and he found out that all but 2 were people attacking the state of Israel. So, 38% of American Jews under 40 think Israel's committing genocide. Under 50%, I come to Canada and people are like, you're lucky you escaped New York. Mamdani is the mayor. 2/3 of New York Jews under 40 voted for Mamdani. So clearly there is another Jewish identity that is completely separated from the state of Israel. I didn't have a single Jewish student who wasn't on in the encampment at Yale, who wasn't in the encampments. And Jewish students were one of the 3 large, certainly there was no larger identity group in the anti-genocide encampments. So there's obviously Jewish identity separate from the state of Israel, especially among younger Jews. And this is a war, and thinking about, this is a conflict about what Jewish identity should be. Just like Russian dissidents argue that being Russian is independent of hating Ukraine. Like Elena Kostyuchenko's book, I Love Russia. And she is, Putin tried to poison her over her pro-Ukraine work. So often political conflict takes the form of these struggles about identity. What you're doing in what I'm doing in the work of mine, I work on a lot of things, but one of the things I do is argue for Palestinian equality and Palestinian, freedom, consistent with Israel, just end the occupation kind of thing. And that's a struggle about Jewish identity, right? And there are plenty of Jews, when Biden said, I'm pro-Israel because without Israel, Jews worldwide would face another Holocaust. That's like, what? I'm an American Jew. His goddamn job as the president is to protect me. What the hell is he saying? Is he saying he isn't going to protect Jews in America? Like, what kind of, that's supposed to be a pro-Jewish comment? That's not a pro-Jewish comment, that's an anti-Semitic, that's saying, I don't care about the Jews here. I'm going to let some other country defend them. No, it's the job of Canada to protect Canadian Jews. It's not the job of some other state. So you can see a similar genocidal speech with the international attack on transgender persons, which is really moving to the fore. Now they, banning transgender, banning medicine for trans kids, and now really there's moving to banning transgender identity generally. So following like the Russia's Gay Propaganda Act, for the good of society, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. That is genocidal. So the ICC definition of genocide, usually intention is the hardest to prove in the case of Israel's actions. In Gaza, it's the easiest to prove, or just as easy as the rest. Now I want to turn to a friend-enemy distinction that is not genocide. A friend-enemy distinction that doesn't define an oppositional group as an existential threat that needs to be completely destroyed. And this kind of friend-enemy distinction is important. It's important in cases of conflict. But you need to have an identity in a conflict that does not commit you to killing everyone else on the other side. You need to have an identity that's just characterized in terms of, gives you a positive identity in contrast to the identity of the group that you're defending yourself from. And then the tricky thing is after the conflict is over, not letting it transform into something like a genocidal identity or a problematically nationalist identity. So Ukraine and Russia had close ties, very close ties. Most Ukrainian families had relatives in Russia, and most Ukrainians had close friends in Russia. So that, everyone was like, well, Ukraine depends so much on Russia, there's no way, you've heard this before, there's no way Ukraine could survive without Russia. We always vacation in Russia. Now after years of war, Ukraine forged an identity based around democracy and anti-Russian sentiment. So the idea was Ukrainians' bond to democracy had partly to do with the fact that they didn't want to live under autocracy like Russia and Belarus. That's like central to Ukrainian identity, disliking politicians, not wanting to live under autocracy. And then it becomes central for Ukraine to tolerate sexual minorities because, Russian fascism sort of begins with hatred of sexual minorities, right? The Gay Propaganda Act, now it's like absolutely deadly to be LGBTQ Russia in Russia. So Kyiv has a big pride parade. This becomes very central to Ukrainian identity. Canada, well, now you guys, I guess us now. Now Canada lives next to a fascist state. That, like Russia has done with Ukraine, has threatened Canada with annexation. This was also not something Ukrainians believed was possible. That Russia had invaded the Donbass in 2014, but the idea of a full-scale invasion up until the night it happened was not something that Ukrainians thought was going to happen. So the essential identity of America is now fascism and white supremacy. That is what America is. America voted twice for Donald Trump, remember? And the second time, Donald Trump was like, I'm going to be a dictator, and I'm going to do mass deportation of, what did he say, 20 million immigrants, or 10, 11 million, I forgot the number he gave, but imagine doing that in Toronto, going to every non-white person and asking for their documents and throwing them in ICE detention until someone could prove they were Canadian. So it's really un-Canadian to do that. But, and Stephen Miller is even more explicit about his fascist ideology. He wants a white supremacist, he was once asked, you want an America where everyone looks like you? And he said, yes. So, but it's not just, it's very explicit, right? The only black member of Trump's cabinet is the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. In other words, that's you want to connect public housing with black people. So he fired the black military leaders. You're essentially a purge of black people in positions of power. He does give a lot of money to HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, but that's because he wants to segregate universities and say that black people don't belong at Harvard, Princeton, or Yale. And now the Civil Rights Division of the United States is devoted now explicitly to hunting out anti-white racism. So that means if a university accepts a black person, they have to worry that they will face a federal civil rights investigation. So you can imagine the standards for admitting a black student now. So I think it's really important to see that Trump was explicit about all this. He was explicit. He said, "Oh, women will not have to vote again because I will be, don't worry, I'll protect him." He was explicit about everything he was doing, and Americans voted for him anyway. So think of the country you live next to. Think of the people in that country and who they voted for. So here's J.D. Vance on American identity. He's the Vice President of the United States. One of the things that you hear people say sometimes is that America is an idea. But America is not just an idea. It is a group of people with a shared history and a common future. It is, in short, a nation. this is illegal to have this definition of identity in Germany, which is what, and Alternative für Deutschland is threatened with being made illegal because they're accused of having this conception of citizenship, which is why J.D. Vance went to the Munich Security Conference and said, and threatened Germany if they banned Alternative für Deutschland, because his vision for America is a Blütenboden conception. In fact, Homeland Security tweeted remigration, and the word remigration was the Alternative für Deutschland's, essentially their campaign slogan in the last elections. And it's a word invented by the Austrian fascist Nazi, Martin Sellner, in his book, Remigration, ein Vorschlag. So, and Martin Sellner advocated stripping citizenship of non-Aryans. So, you know, you might say, so remember, words are instantiations of speech practices. This word, remigration, was invented by someone who meant it to include stripping citizenship of non-white people. Is it really plausible to say, oh, that's not what we mean. We mean that word with that origin and that history, except for that part. So to exemplify this shared identity, Vance told the audience what a cemetery plot, here is family's ancestral. That's just an idea, not an idea. My friends, that is a homeland. In other words, blood and soil. Vance's conception of ethnic identity is a white homeland, though the race part goes unmentioned. And I should say that in American racial ideology, black Americans have a role, but as subordinate. So in Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race, his 1916 book, which sort of invents great replacement theory. Hitler reads it in prison in 1924 and writes it in fan notes. I'm proud to say Madison Grant is a proud Yale grad. And so Madison Grant doesn't call for the expulsion of black people. He's essentially calling for them to be, their population to be culled and controlled so they capped at a certain number minority, and they're a servile group. So that's the complexity of America. You're not going to find that in fascist movements like the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. They're not going to say, okay, we need a black population to do the cheap labor. But that is part of American white supremacy. So Dara Van Noor, an artist who I think lives in London, I messaged her on Instagram to invite her to this talk, but I'm guessing she isn't here. She has this project that she's putting up where she puts up these plaques of, which are supposed to be these sort of plaques, like that would be up if America annexed Canada. And redefining Canadian identity, I find these were very powerful because they're, I think she spoke at Western on Monday. So that's like redefining identity, right? If you get annexed, your identity will be redefined. So here is an American telling you guys hate this shit, but as I discovered from some emails after my publication. But I think just theoretically, this is what I would say as a theorist, and I'm not a Canadian. I'm really first to put, and I've been told this is a very American thing to do, tell Canadians what their identity should be. But I'm still an American. So Canada must prepare itself for a conflict with the United States. To do this, it must acquire a Canadian identity reflecting defensive nationalism. Unlike you, and here's I think the way forward. Unlike Ukraine, Canada is already a multiracial democracy. Ukraine isn't. There are not many non-Ukrainians there. So I mean there are a few, and a few important ones. But in fact, the world's healthiest multiracial democracy. Since American identity is racist and fascist, multiracial democracy should be central to Canadian defensive nationalist identity, just as tolerance is central to Ukrainian identity. America increasingly bans critical history of its past. Canadian national identity should be based on leaning into it, right? Doing the opposite of a fascist country actually can give you a substantial identity. It's already a substantial identity that Canada has. That's the nice point. It's not like this is invented. You know, Canadian identity should be based on a shared anti-Americanism. And here's where I just get wild. Ukraine's ties to and dependence on Russia were once thought to be unbreakable. And as we have seen from that case, it is easily possible to sever such ties, to divorce yourself from America. You know, a general social repudiation of those who maintain such connections to the United States is necessary to cultivate. At least a sort of like, oh my God, you're American. This is a country that voted twice for Trump. Of course there are good Russians, right? Of course there are good Russians. There are Russians who fought against Putin. There are Russians who left Russia. But I expect you to treat me with disdain just because I am American. But, you know, I mean, think about how people react to people saying they're Russian. They react like, you know, and to some extent, Israel now tragically as well. But, you know, shouldn't you react that way to being American right now? And, you know, and I'm just shocked. You know, I was out with some Canadians, some well-to-do Canadians who were like, oh, I really liked your Canadian patriotism. But, you know, you should say when you, in your op-eds that Canada must lower its taxes on the wealthy by 10% or we'll all move to Florida. Imagine another country in the world. I've never met citizens of any other country in the world. Like imagine a French person being like, I will sever all my connections to being French and move to Florida unless France lowers its taxes. So think about how weak Canadian identity must be in order for that sentence to be utterable. You'll move away from your family. You'll move away from the place you grew up from. You'll move away from the values, from universal health care. You'll move away from these social values that make Canada so really the the healthiest multiracial democracy in the world in order to get a tax break. That's a weak national identity. So here's the conclusion. It is much easier to pretend that the problem we face is disinformation. First, disinformation is tractable, whereas social identities are not tractable. It's like they're much more amorphous. Though we see in the case of Germany a very clear conception of social identity, like J.D. Vance's comments would disqualify the Republican Party from running in Germany because so explicitly voted. So it's a much harder problem to form democratically acceptable policy around problematic social identities. Nevertheless, that really is the problem. If you look at Trump's messaging, like ICE does its advertising to UFC fans and Formula One fans, like very football fans, very macho environments. It's a very masculine identity. The idea is supposed to be a real man supports rich people not paying taxes. You know, Elon Musk is a real man. So even though you don't have health insurance, your kids have no future. If you're a real man, you'll support Elon Musk. It's social identity. In times of war and conflict, it is necessary to lean into new social identities, which can be based on a shared commitment to anti-fascism. Thank you.